proceeding along in our series of this inner court, the nervous system within us, and our meditation, and the Hebrew letters, the 7 double letters, right? We talked about this menorah that's in the holy place, in the sanctuary, in the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, and how it's all connected to one. It had to be one piece of gold, and all the 7 branches were connected to one. And we discussed last week the first light, which was the first branch, which was Bet. So if we think about this from deep within us, Ein Sof, deep within us, pure consciousness, the Holy of Holies within us, emanating and coming out into the holy place or the inner court in the sanctuary. We're going from pure being, Ein Sof, deep within, and we're coming out into the holy place in the inner court, and then into eventually the outer court. So it's different. Often when we look at our meditation, we look at it from the conscious thinking level, going down into the subconscious thinking level, then into what we call being, or the source of thought, or Ein Sof. This view, we're looking from the Holy of Holies, which we said, of course, is beyond time and space. Remember when we talked about the ark taking up no space, even though it has dimensions? Because in the Holy of Holies, we're in the transcendent. Well, this transcendent is just full, it's just divine, full of divine consciousness. So space needs to be made for the relative sphere of creativity. And that space is the energy of the letter Bet. So here we are now, emanating from no time and space to a place where there is space. And there's a whole theosophical, architectural study of how that happened, and especially in Lurianic Kabbalism. We don't get too much into it in Ablafian Kabbalism, which is based really on experience. So the idea is we experience that being and pure consciousness. We don't define in every detail how it became absolute, became relative. So we have space now with this energy of the first menorah in the holy sphere. And that was Bet and related to the planet Saturn and the first day of the week. So the next letter in the double letter series is Gimel. And the planet is Jupiter. And it's interesting because as we understand it, even from our meditative experience, when we do find ourselves in the gap or in an area where there's no thought, there's no name, there's no Hebrew letter, then, and more as we can experience that in our meditation, we experience that as an expanded space. Even as we experience that expanded space and the vibration of it, it's coming out of the Holy of Holies within us. It's coming out of Ein Sof. Because any experience that we can define in relative terms is not absolute, pure Ein Sof divine consciousness. Its essence is. Does that make sense? So when we're experiencing Belima, which is nothing and everything at the same time, pure divine bliss, when there's space, be it expanded or not, that's the beginning of the relative. And the next step from space is order. which in and of itself indicates time. So if we have order, order means numerically 1, 2, 3. Something becomes before something, and then something comes after something, right? That's order. Right? First, I take my glasses off, then I can't see, then I walk into the table. There's an order to that, right? So this is what's happening even within us, even in the inner core. There's no time and space. There's space. And then there's Gimel. The vibration of Gimel is the cycle of running and returning, the feedback loop that pierces through all of creation. Gilgal, it's called in the Sefer Yetzirah, which means literally wheel. So if you looked up Gilgal, which is spelled Gimel Lamed, and got the English translation, it would probably say in modern Hebrew, wheel, but it's very often in ancient spiritual text referred to as cycle. So the cycle of creation is beginning. The cycle of what we call running and returning. First, there's space for it, but then every movement from divine absolute into relative is a circle. It has a positive and negative and neutral, just like the subatomic neutron, proton, and electron. But we don't want to make this study an intellectual one because it's very important that we understand these things, binah, understanding, in terms of chakmah, experience of wisdom. So what are we saying? We're saying that when we're in that field of pure consciousness, we begin to experience space, and then it flows into an order. It's called in the Kabbalah, Seder Hashtil Shilot. Seder means order. And once we have order, we have Bria, which is creation happening. It's a movement of vibration, which creates sound. We talked about how faster things vibrate, that frequency, the higher the pitch, the lower things vibrate, the lower the pitch. So vibration creates sound. So we have sound and light. The Gimel is the beginning of those feedback circles or wheels in our inner court. And the Sefer Yetzirah tells us it's the energy throughout creation of peace and war. Its foundation is shalom. Its foundation is peace. Its repose is war. So this happens, this begins, this cycling of protons, electrons, and neutrons, and deep within the relative sphere of the nervous system and our consciousness. It happens and it continues to happen over and over again. So what does that mean to us in terms of our meditation or our lives? It means that we can have, just like with Bet in space, we can have the full experience as long as we're open to receiving it, and as long as we are fluid and not rigid or judgmental, we can then experience peace even in war internally, because it's the foundation of that order of natural law, the flow of consciousness. So in our inner court, the menorah of 7 branches, the space is lit. And now the cycle, the creative cycle of running and returning with the Gimel almost looks like a boot walking along. We can have peace in war. So there's always going to be in our lives this feeling of peace within us and a feeling of war within us. We vacillate. Every human being goes through that, right? There's some peace even in the most crazed, hateful person. There's some peace that they experience. And even in the most peaceful person, there's some war in their lives internally. The point of the neuroplasticity of our nervous system and its relation to meditation and divine consciousness is that we experience the eternal in the relative. So the essence, the foundation of Gimel, and this second day, right, which is Monday, the second day is the experience of peace, even when we're at war inside. Can that make some sense? So if we relate it to our meditation, we can be having a meditation where our thoughts are running crazy. People like to use the term monkey brain, right? But if we're just in a state of surrender and the brain is being a monkey brain and at war, we can still be silent, peaceful witnesses of the monkey brain war that's going on. And ultimately, the same is true in the world of action, in the outer court. Does that make sense? Because that's the critical point of the teaching. We can have shalom even during war. And when we have shalom even during war, be it internally or otherwise, our actions in the war are according to natural law. Because we're connected with divine consciousness. Even in the world of action, where we may be struggling with ourselves or someone else or anything. But if we're unable to receive those vibrations of the foundation of Gimel in peace, if our hearts are closed and rigid, then what happens is we get sucked into the war. And the war dominates our feelings, our actions, our thoughts. It's like a never-ending cycle of defensive fear and anger. So the foundation of the Gimel in this space, in the holy court, is the experience of that peace, even with the inevitable war that we all have. Not every day, sometimes every day, sometimes once a week, sometimes once a year, whatever. It's the flow of pure consciousness and touching consciousness where we experience that open door of the Gimel energy, its foundation being peace. Same thing with life and bed. In death, we experience life. Now, as far as the brain is concerned, and again, I don't want this to become an intellectual exercise, but I'm just going to read from my old friend, Dr. Tony Nader, who's a brilliant neurologist, what he says about this part of the basal ganglia. Now, remember, we're talking about the whole nervous system in relation to the menorah of seven double letters, right? We could talk about this in relation to the spinal cord or the various nerves that it's connected to. We just happen to be talking about the brain and the basal ganglia. So this next in from, we were at Saturn and we were at the putamen in the basal ganglia, the outermost part of the basal ganglia in the brain. And now we're at the globus pallidus, it's called, the next chunk of brain inwards. After the putamen lies a global structure which constitutes the major output of the basal ganglia. This is the globus pallidus. It acts as the major instructor, which produces balanced, all-embracing instructions to guide action. It is involved in higher order control, planning and execution of complex strategies, as well as functions related to the limbic system, including maintenance of inner balance and action in accordance with inner and outer demands. So that's the energy in the brain of the gimel. We talked about the putamen being bet energy and the globus pallidus being gimel energy. And I can't stress enough that all of these things come into one. The dualities come to yichad, the oneness of pure consciousness. Okay, so is there any, by the way, this, in case you weren't here last time, this part of the neurology and the brain, I'm reading from Dr. Tony Nader in his book called Human Physiology. It's an interesting book. It relates the Veda and the human physiology. It's a college level book and it can get a little tedious, but it's a good book to have, even if you use it as a reference book.